Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Jim Ninsel, host of AZ Illustrated Politics, our weekly analysis and commentary on local, state, and national affairs. On tonight's show, we'll talk with Congressman Raul Grijalva about the prospects of immigration reform in the House of Representatives and find out why he wants to delay the approval of the Rosemont mine in the Santa Rita Mountains. Then we'll talk with the AZ Illustrated Politics panel about John McCain's push for a path to citizenship as part of immigration reform, the latest on this year's city council elections, and much more. That's all coming up on AZ Illustrated Politics, but first, a look at today's top stories.
The tracks for Tucson's modern streetcar are all but complete, and now the first of the cars has arrived in the old Pueblo. This morning, a flatbed trailer delivered the first car to Tucson. The rest will arrive in the coming months. Construction of an underpass for the streetcar on the U of A campus is still ongoing. The hope is to have the streetcar linking the university and downtown running by next summer. Arizona Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema is back from a trip to Afghanistan. According to a press release from her office, Sinema was part of a congressional delegation which met with U.S. troops and Afghan government officials. The trip by the bipartisan delegation lasted for 3 days. And the Arizona Department of Transportation is halting construction on Arizona highways this weekend in an effort to help ease traffic for those hitting the road for the long Labor Day holiday. And that's a look at tonight's headlines.
The Gang of Eight's comprehensive immigration reform proposal passed out of the Senate with bipartisan support earlier this summer, but it has stalled in the U.S. House of Representatives. Here to talk about the prospects of immigration reform and other issues facing southern Arizona, Congressman Raul Grijalva. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it.
On the whole immigration reform, when it passed out of the Senate, there was this last-minute amendment that added this border surge that would double the Border Patrol, put even more fencing on the border. Was that overkill, in your opinion?
It was total overkill and excessive. And I thought you paid too much. You paid all that to get an additional 3 votes. So you went from 11 Republicans voting for it, potentially voting, to 14. So I don't know if that was worth $35 billion. But my point being that that's been now one of the flaws that many of us feel. The sooner we get into conference, the more we can ask about accountability and efficiency and how you're really going to use that, because it is excessive and the price tag on it is enormous.
And last week, the Republican National Committee, led by Tucson and Bruce Ashe, actually passed a resolution that called for no path to citizenship, opposed a path to citizenship for anyone who has entered the country illegally, even the DREAM Act kids. Your thoughts on that?
Talk about shooting yourself, okay? Here's the Republican Party on this issue. Has been the greatest unifying political force for the Latino community in 4 or 5 elections. We're not monolithic, different opinions, different points of view politically, but on this issue, there's unity. And, you know, Ashe didn't do himself or the Republican Party any favors with that resolution. You have effectively put yourself in a corner for a generation politically, and locked the door on any future of a Republican presidential presence in the executive office in a generation. It was politically naive and stupid when I think, I hate to admit that, but the Republican Party does have some ability to inroad into the Latino community. But when you do this mean-spirited and marginalize that community, you've effectively closed the door on an ability to communicate.
And what are your thoughts on just the prospects of actually getting a bill passed for closing in on another election year here pretty rapidly?
And I answered, you asked me a good question on that, and I said my heart was optimistic, my reality was doubtful. But 3 paths to go. We can do something in the House to get to conference. We can take one of the bills that's lying there, 5 of them, and try to use that to go to conference. You can put a marker down on a separate bill that is better, but at the end of the day, Boehner has to lift this majority of the majority, let the Congress work its will, and like he did with the Violence Against Women Act, like he did with the budget resolution last year, put it on the floor, and 180 Democrats and 35 Republicans passed those two, and I would say that that would be the same margin on comprehensive reform.
Let me shift gears to a local issue. Today you had a press conference where you denounced a flyer that went out attacking Daniel Hernandez, the Gabby Giffords intern who became famous for rushing to her side after she was shot. He's now on the Sunnyside School Board. He's facing a recall, and he's openly gay. Some anti-gay flyer came out, and you said you thought this needed an investigation by the authorities.
Yeah, and specifically because of hate crimes and the federal jurisdiction by the federal government, U.S. Attorney, FBI, etc. And the reason is not to over-exaggerate what happened, but there is a cause and effect. The people that did that flyer, and yet in source has been very difficult to identify. The only copies that seem to be available is on Huffington Post. But the fact remains that that hateful piece of literature has a cause and an effect. And while you have the freedom of speech and the First Amendment protection to say those vile things and to write those vile things, the hate crimes law says if those having a cause that endangers, threatens, jeopardizes the health and safety of individuals, then it merits an investigation. And we think we should go as far as if there's a link between cause and effect, and hopefully by doing that, to make people think twice. Words have meaning beyond what you think, and there is a cause and effect, and there are protections for individuals from that kind of attack.
Let me ask you about the Rosemont mine. You recently teamed up with Congressman Barber to write a letter to the Agricultural Secretary saying that this process needs more public input. Why do you think we need more public input on that?
Well, it's a due diligence issue, and we felt that the Forest Service was rushing to judgment to avoid some of the regulatory requirements that are coming on board regarding the study and the depth and the due diligence of that study. Yeah, I've said over and over again about Rosemont. It's about intended and unintended consequences. And while Rosemont brags that they're the epicenter of the economic revival of all of southern Arizona, they're not. There's a lot at risk here. So let's look at intended and unintended consequences. So 20 years from now, when that mine closes, that this community is not looking at a shattered tourism industry, water depletion we can't get back, and environmental contamination we can't clean up. Due diligence, all consequences on the table, that's why a full study is needed.
A lot of concern this weekend about whether the Obama administration is going to move forward with an attack on Syria in the wake of revelations regarding chemical weapon use there. Your thoughts on what's happening in that situation?
Very interestingly, I signed on to a letter with Tea Party colleagues, more conservative Republican colleagues, and some of us others on that as well, basically asking for one fundamental thing. Having learned that lesson in the Bush administration, having learned that lesson from Vietnam, that the consent to war and to major military missions has to come before Congress and has to come before the House of Representatives. I think that's the power and authority. And I think the president, before he does anything unilateral, preemptive, that Congress and the representatives there should take their vote, let that debate go in front of the American people, and deal. And if there is consent to go forward, he has it. If there isn't, then it doesn't happen. There's a great deal of risk given the fact that we have Afghanistan, Iraq, and the region layered on top of that over the last 15 years, and now some more direct military action. As horrific and as ugly as killing your own people is what happened here, and chemical warfare, as prohibitive as that is and should be, I think the president would be wise to not only consult Congress, but to get the consent as well, as the Constitution calls for.
There was a close vote in the House last month on whether to defund the NSA's collection of phone records following the revelations that came out with Edward Snowden and the Guardian's reporting on that. You voted in favor of that. Your thoughts on whether or not that's going to come up for another vote and why you think
I think it will. I think there's some language discussions that's going on to try to narrow what the definition of that is. I think if some of the revelations that come out before the vote that came after it, I think it would have been a significant more votes for it. And I say that because the sweeps, the disclosure as to the amount, and the lack of checks and balances. No judicial review, no place in which to go and have disclosure. Yeah. The delicacy between protecting this country from those that want to do harm to us and the right and privacy and individual rights of the American citizens is a constant delicacy. NSA, the sweeps, the overall monitoring, I think broached that delicacy and broached that balance terribly, and that's why I voted the way I did.
We've got less than a minute left, but the question of whether or not the government is facing a shutdown over the funding of Obamacare, your thoughts on how that's developing with the Republicans?
I think that's another Russian roulette choice that Boehner has and the Republican Party and the Senate have. They want to keep twirling the gun and hoping that it's always an empty chamber. Inevitably, if they want to push it to that point, I think the consequences fiscally for this nation and that party politically are going to be devastating. I don't think they have the will to do it, but if they insist on holding this up, I think the political consequences is going to turn that decision around within weeks.
All right, and that is where we're going to have to leave things. Thank you so much for coming by, Congressman Grijalva. We'll be right back with our panel to discuss the week in review.
This is the indiscriminate, inconceivable horror of chemical weapons. This is what Assad did to his own people.
Secretary of State John Kerry delivered a forceful argument for taking military action against Syria as punishment for last week's attack on Syrian civilians.
We discussed the options and the consequences of whatever action is or isn't taken with two members of Congress who were briefed on the evidence by the White House.
And we get the perspectives of NewsHour analysts Mark Shields and David Brooks.
Then the race to save the centuries-old sequoias at Yosemite National Park, threatened by wildfires burning just miles away. We have a report from the scene.
We wrap up our look at the legacy of the March on Washington 50 years on. Tonight, the long journey of the civil rights movement and its unfinished business.
And we remember Seamus Heaney, the Nobel Prize-winning poet who died today in his native Ireland.
That's all ahead on tonight's NewsHour.
The concept for the show is to go after that week's news in Arizona. What were the hot topics? What were the hot stories of the week? We see this bringing a depth of coverage. We'll take one or two topics and we'll get deep into them. My excitement comes from the fact that we get to do journalism like this on TV.
Earlier this week, U.S. Senators John McCain and Jeff Flake held an immigration town hall in Mesa, Arizona, in an effort to build support for the comprehensive immigration reform bill that they sponsored and pushed through the Senate earlier this summer. Here to talk about McCain's strong push for a path to citizenship and other news of the week, Pima County Democratic Party Chairman Don Jorgensen, Republican strategist Jonathan Paton, and Tucson Hispanic Chamber of Commerce President Lea Marquez-Peterson. Thanks to all of you for being here. Lea, you were at the town hall this week, and McCain did make that strong push for a path to citizenship. He said it's not going to be an easy path. It takes 13 years. There are fines. There are fees. But he said at the end of the day, folks deserved a chance to become citizens. And why do you think there's such resistance to that in the House of Representatives?
You know, it really seems to be the line in the sand that's been drawn by the Republican Congress, or those who are Republican in Congress. What's interesting is McCain stressed that it is 13 years as pathway to citizenship. It is paying back taxes. There are penalties involved. It is not a simple pathway that people must take, and it's certainly something that's a priority, especially for the Latino community who's spoken up about the importance of a pathway to citizenship. Senator McCain and Senator Flake have been encouraging the business community with their recent meetings throughout the state to engage with our Republican congressmen and talk about the importance of passing immigration reform and, you know, at least being at the table in terms of negotiating on that pathway or legal status for the 11 million in the shadows.
Jonathan, what do you think is at the root of the resistance here and on the part of Republicans in the House of Representatives?
Well, I think that it's an age-old question within the Republican Party and all across the country about granting citizenship for those who've come into the country illegally. I think what was interesting is that the House is a co-equal branch of government. They have not yet had a bill that has been passed to go up. But I found it interesting that Senator Flake, he certainly supports this bill that has a pathway to citizenship, but he's never said that he wouldn't support a House bill that didn't have it in it. And that's an important distinction to make. We don't know what's going to come out of the House. They're certainly going to debate it. And I think that anything that's ultimately going to pass and get the support of the American people is going to have to be fully debated throughout Congress.
And Don, how do you feel? You're on the side of John McCain in this particular instance.
How about that? Yeah, we are. Really credit John McCain for standing up strong. I'm a little concerned to hear there's possibility Senator Flake might backtrack, and I hope that's not true.
Well, he hasn't backtracked. He never said that he was not support something that didn't have it in the bill. That's never been his position.
Good. What I like about what McCain said is he really focused on not just the realities of the situation, as Lea pointed out, but the economic impact as well. I think he noted that if immigration reform were to occur, just in Arizona alone, that would bring in an additional $616 million and create over 8,000 jobs in 1 year. Economic experts have also noted across the country that there are right now 7 million jobs that go unfilled because of the lack of skilled workers, and that number is going to double by 2020. This is an economic solution as well as what I believe to be a human rights solution, and I applaud the senator for supporting it and staying strong.
And Jonathan, one of the points that John McCain makes is that it's important for the Republican Party in the future in terms of winning national elections to pass an immigration reform bill and have a chance at persuading Latino voters to consider voting Republican, because until you level the playing field in his mind, you're not going to be able to attract the Latino voters. And what do you think of that political argument?
Well, I think that I just look at the issue on its surface, and I think that the open question for me and for many conservatives has always been on the enforcement side and exactly how that's really going to work out. And I think there's still an open debate. There's a lot of questions in the House as to how that's actually going to play out. Will the money actually be spent? What sort of metrics are going to be met? A lot of people feel that they were very open-ended and that there wasn't a lot of firm commitment. I was just on the border this last weekend and talked to ranchers that have found six people have passed away on their ranch in the last decade in one ranch. There's been a lot of drug trafficking, so there's a lot of people that are concerned with border security, and they are deeply suspicious about whether that's actually going to be accomplished in this bill or not. And I think that's where the heartburn is across the board. And I think that there's been a lot of promises from Washington over the years, and I think a lot of people don't feel like those promises have been kept.
But do you think McCain's overstating the need for this in terms of
I think that it's short-sighted to say, in order to reach out to one group, we're going to change policy or go against principles that someone may hold. I think that we have to debate the issue not over politics, but debate the issue on its merits. And I think that there are really strong questions that have to be asked and have to be debated in the House of Representatives about how border security is going to be accomplished. And good people can disagree, even within a party. The Republican Party is not a monolithic party that believes in only one thing.
And to that point, I actually want to shift gears here, and that's the Senate Conservative Fund, headed up by Senator Jim DeMint, this week launched a radio ad targeting Jeff Flake over his recent comments that he would not shut down the government to force a defunding of Obamacare. This is kind of a push that's coming from senators like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. Senator Flake's reaction was very brief. He said on Twitter, "Oh, whatever." Lea, what do you think of what's going on here with Senator Flake?
Yeah, it's interesting. As I read through those comments also, I think he just felt this was not the answer. This was perhaps a political maneuver or placement for Obamacare, and I don't think it was something that he felt was a realistic option.
And Don, what do you think of these threats that are going on that the government might get shut down over the funding of Obamacare?
Well, it's a replay of what we've seen pretty much each of the past year, if not each of President Obama's years, where the Republicans are doing anything they can to obstruct any measure of success. It really ties back into the question about immigration reform too, and that has to do with this fight within the Republican Party and whether there's the political courage, perhaps on Speaker Boehner's part, to even bring a bill forward so there can be debate. And there's talk now that it may be delayed, it may be pushed into 2014, and at that point then you have those debates within perhaps the soul of the Republican Party as to whether you have the conservatives or the so-called new Republican Party made up of the Tea Partiers. Debate's a kind word. I suspect it'll be more of a shouting match, but I think that's the real danger.
You know, and speaking to the question you asked Jonathan around the importance to the Latino voter, I mean, that's not the only issue, certainly, but I think that this makes sense for our nation. The Congressional Budget Office has talked about reducing our federal deficit, and I think numbers I saw were close to $900 billion through 2033. It shores up our Social Security challenges. You're hearing from, I think, a bipartisan group, business owners, the Latino community, and others, that it's time for federal immigration reform. We need Congress to act.
And Jonathan, Senator McCain was on Morning Joe earlier this week. He was defending Jeff Flake's comments, or he was defending Jeff Flake against the targeting that he was experiencing over this advertisement. But also he was saying that it's not just Obamacare that's going to create a fight within the Republican Party. It is immigration. It is the question of whether the country should be more isolationist. And what do you think of this sort of civil war that John McCain's describing within the Republican Party?
Well, it's interesting because I think that let's just touch base really quickly on what they were saying about Flake, and that, first of all, Jeff Flake is probably one of the most fiscally conservative members of Congress in his time in the House. He's a co-sponsor of the bill to repeal Obamacare. I think his feeling is that this method was probably not going to work, and it was ultimately going to be costing taxpayers more money. But I don't think that almost every action he's ever taken has been against Obamacare and supporting the repeal of Obamacare. There's a lot of different opinions within the Republican Party. Right now, you're seeing this over Syria. You're seeing that there's a kind of a libertarian streak that's going through the Republican Party that actually is agreeing with people on the other side of the aisle about whether we should attack in Syria. I think having a healthy debate is healthy. I don't think any party that's monolithic and only believes in one thing is really going to be viable for the long term in America. And so I think that we've always talked about a big tent. This is a big tent. We have a lot of people who have their own opinions and have their own ways of looking at things.
Lea, what's your take on this debate that's going on?
I agree with Jonathan. I think it is healthy to have the debate. Unlike having one bill passed, what we've heard recently is that the House may take this in smaller chunks, run through different committees, different pieces. I also think the Senate bill was a compromise by a bipartisan group of senators, so it's not something that perhaps fit both sides of the aisle perfectly. There are questions the business community has risen around the W visas and quotas and certain industries that perhaps the numbers aren't right there exactly as those industries need. So I think there's a lot of work that can still be done on the bill. So I'm encouraged to see the House take it up via committee.
And I want to touch base, Don, on the referendum effort to block the election overhaul bill that was passed by the legislature earlier this year. The folks who are opposed to that bill have until, I think, early September to turn in, I think, 85,000 valid signatures. How's that signature gathering effort going?
The information I've received is that it's going well. Their expectation of the folks that are behind it, and we're talking about the referendum to block HB 2305, yes. What's been called voter suppression acts and such. It's a high threshold. It's actually 87,000 by September 12th. And in any of these kind of petition gathering efforts, you always try to get 35% over roughly. So we're talking about 115,000 signatures. That's a pretty daunting task. I suspect that, from what I understand, they'll exceed the 87,000. Whether there's enough to cover any challenges or such remain to be seen.
Jonathan, what are you hearing?
Well, I question the math, because it's not 30% or 35% of 87,000. It's actually that 87,000 needs to be 70% over a larger number. And right now they've said their goal is 120,000 signatures. That doesn't put you at an 86,400 signature threshold. Nobody has gotten anything on the ballot with less than 30% error rate in the last decade. That is under a different standard, which is what they call substantial compliance. They look through the ballots, they look through the signatures, see what complies and what doesn't. Well, this is actually, for referral, it's a strict compliance standard, which means it's a much higher benchmark. They said their goal is 120,000. I don't think they're going to even reach the 120,000. I don't think they're going to be able to overturn what the legislature passed and what the governor signed. And I think that ultimately 2305 will remain the law of the land in the state of Arizona.
And Lea, you've had some concerns about the HB 2305.
I haven't, and I've seen petition gatherers, and I'm hearing the different comments, seeing emails and information on it. Certainly concerns about the number of signatures you need in order to be on the ballots, concerns about the permanent early voting list, whether they'll make their 120,000 signatures, I mean, who knows? But I think that if it does make the ballot, it'll be an interesting debate.
All right, and it's coming up soon. Don, we had a city primary this week. It was perhaps the sleepiest primary I have seen in my history of covering elections, not a single contested race, but now we're into the main event, the general election. 2 city council races. I think the one to really watch here is Karen Ulick, the Democratic incumbent, in a rematch against Republican Ben Buehler-Garcia. He lost by fewer than 200 votes last time. Is this something Karen Ulick has to worry about?
Well, she takes any opponent seriously, and familiar with this opponent who she did defeat 2 years ago. Obviously, she's prepared. I'm glad you described it well as sleepy. We had to wait a couple of days even for the daily newspaper to realize there was a primary and to report it. So thank you for recognizing that. What I found interesting, it's kind of surprising that there were 3 races, and yet you have to wonder about the Republican Party when you have a citywide election with 3 open seats and they can only produce 1 solid candidate, and that is Mr. Buehler-Garcia. It will be the race to focus on. Both candidates are going to max out on the funding and the match, so that'll be there. I suspect that from what we've already seen, Mr. Buehler-Garcia also has money coming from out of state. There's independent expenditure committees being formed, and of course now, thanks to the Supreme Court, a lot of that money will be shadow money. So I'll be curious to see what's done with that.
And I'd just like to say the Tucson Weekly actually reported the results a week ahead of time because we knew how it was going to turn out. Jonathan, your thoughts on whether Ben Buehler-Garcia can do it this time?
Well, he came within about 700 votes last time. He came extremely
200.
close, or 200 rather. He came extremely close last time. It certainly wasn't a mandate for Karen Ulick, and I think that of all the members of the city council, I think that she has, in my opinion at least, and I think the opinion of a lot of people, one of the most anti-business stances on the council, and I think that that's going to be a huge issue. It already is a huge issue in this race. Ben has worked extremely hard. I think he's very close to qualifying and for his matching funds. I think there's a very robust effort. I think they felt that he was one of the weakest candidates, or that she was one of the weakest candidates in this race. So they felt like they would put their resources into targeting her. As far as outside money, I mean, there's outside money all over the state. The election issue that we talked about, there's been tons of outside Washington union money that's come in to fight on that effort. I'm sure there's all kinds of interests from all sides, and I would expect that there'd be something probably from the Democratic side if it gets really close to support their candidate as well.
And then unfortunately we're out of time, so
I was going to say I want folks to check the facts. The idea about not supporting business is just not true.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave things. Thank you guys for being here, and we will be right back with some closing thoughts. That's our show for tonight, but you can learn more about politics by visiting azpm.org or by following us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Jim Ninsel. Thanks for watching another edition of AZ Illustrated Politics.